then you get a place like that. What's that? Oh, there's companions in that? Well, that's metaphorical only in the same sense as the fruit is, you see. That if the Qur'an says you eat a piece of fruit and it's telling you when you eat it, you'll say, this is something like what I used to eat. Well, it means then it must be different. So it's not exactly fruit like we know fruit. But in a way that is familiar to us, it's something like fruit. That's what I'm saying of companions. You might say metaphorically, in that it could be companionship and it would remind us of what good companionship is like, but then again it's something we don't imagine. It's so much better than that. So that paradise is familiar, but more than you can expect. Okay? Well, that's a thing that I'm afraid is often misunderstood by Muslims when they say there are verses of the Qur'an that are abrogated that tell you this means that some verses are overruled by other verses. That is, a verse says this, but another verse tells you that's not true anymore. There's no such pair of verses in the Qur'an. It's impossible. The Qur'an says it doesn't have any contradiction, so how could there be one verse that tells you something different than another verse? When the ayah says, if it came from other than Allah, surely they would find in it ikhtilafan kathiran, many inconsistencies. There are none. There's no inconsistency. Where the misunderstanding often comes is, for example, someone will say, and someone told me, I said, can you show me an abrogated verse? He says, this one, it says, don't pray if you've been drinking. But this ayah says, don't drink. But those are not two different things. This one is not different than that one. To say, don't pray when you've been drinking is not erased by a verse which says don't drink. Those don't say different things. It's a thing that the law is well familiar with, that you have, in effect, all you need is one law, if that's the case. The law says behave. And that eliminates all the other laws. But it doesn't. And it's in that same spirit that you may find this misunderstanding among people. They say, another example is people will say, the Qur'an says, don't take a second wife unless you can treat them equally. But they say, in this verse, it says you can take 4. So it's a contradiction. But it's not a contradiction. The one is a qualification, the other is a limitation. It's called a contradistinction, or what is contrapuntal, but it's not in conflict. Saying don't have more than one if you can't treat them equally is not the opposite of saying don't take more than 4. Exactly. That's what I'm telling you, is that there's no such thing as an abrogated verse. If by abrogation you mean this verse tells you this one isn't true anymore, there's no such verse like that. There are verses which swallow up other verses, but they don't contradict them. So it comes under that test in the sense that if somebody wants to find a contradiction in the Qur'an, he's welcome to even examine the so-called abrogated verses, and he won't find contradiction. Okay, I hope that satisfies what I'm getting at. There's also the point that where that argument is often used by missionaries, where they will say the Qur'an abrogates other verses, so it must contain contradictions. Well, they don't seem to realize that any verse that anybody has ever talked about involving abrogation was related to legal matters. And yet the ayah in the Qur'an that talks about abrogation is a Meccan ayah, whereas the laws didn't come till Medina. So what's being talked about, that some ayah is replaced by another ayah, can't mean the ayat of the Qur'an. It has to mean previous ayah. It has to mean other things that people had before the Qur'an. Let's see. A medical student once posed this question: how can we say the Qur'an is authentic? To prove it, should you refer to hadith? Well, I don't know what help that would be. Refer to hadith if you mean the Qur'an is true because I have a hadith that says so. That won't prove anything to anybody. But the authenticity of the Qur'an was the thing that I was trying to talk about, that you have to eliminate the possibilities. If somebody says your book is not a revelation, then you have to ask him, tell me, what is it? What is it then? If he says it's a lie, you say, show me a lie. Where did it tell a lie? If he says your prophet was a lunatic, say, show me a crazy thing. If he tells you he was a liar, show me the lie. If he was a lunatic, how do you explain his information? If he was a liar, how do you explain his attitude? So you have to give it back to someone to say, if you claim it is this, you have to prove it's that. I can show you why it can't be that. So you establish it by eliminating the alternatives. Question from a non-Muslim. So the Qur'an has proved itself with the past. What has it got to say about the future? Oh, yes, a great deal. That's a favorite subject. If you want to talk about hadith, you have a narration that says that the wonders of this book never cease, meaning that in every generation there are new surprises. History may continue for 10,000 years, and there will still be Muslims saying, I never noticed that before. That's amazing. Something new in every generation. What it has to say about today, there's a lot of ayat. I mentioned one there concerning the origin of the universe. It also mentions certain things that people expect to find. It tells you, for example, in an ayah which has a very interesting construction, it tells you about the dabba. And the dabba is any kind of an animal that crawls. It tells you dabba live in the heavens and on earth. Which is telling you someday somebody evidently is going to find a dabba somewhere else. Some crawling, living thing, someplace else. Because it mentions the dabba in the heavens, the earth, and the places in between them. So as far as you see and where you are and all the places in between there's dabba. No one's found one yet, but see, that's the thing that when it is found, the Muslim can say, I knew it. It must be true. The Quran says so. That's an example of that kind of thing. It mentions what some are now, in fact, it was just in the newspaper that I was looking up. Let's see, the brother's got on his knee there now. When it's talking about Halley's Comet, is due to appear in February, March, 86. It tells you where do all these comets come from. It talks about a thing called the Oort cloud, which is like, you might say, a shell around the solar system containing these balls of ice and rock, and this is where the comets seem to originate. So the theory goes. And they named the place after this astronomer named Oort. But that seems to be what the Qur'an is talking about when it talks about a wall, a division, a barrier, a line, a boundary at some certain distance as you leave the earth. Remains open to discussion. But that's the kind of thing that the early Muslim astronomers, mathematicians, biologists, medical men, chemists, and so on, that's the kind of thing that guided them. They'd see some little thing in the Quran and say, that looks interesting. What will I find if I look? And they found a lot of surprising things. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got still more here. You referred to the Messiah being killed by Jews. Isn't it true the Messiah was substituted and will return? I didn't say the Messiah was killed by the Jews. I said that's what the Jews said. And that, in fact, is what is the point that is made in the Quran. It says the Jews said, we killed the Messiah. And then it goes on to say they were mistaken. They didn't kill him. They thought they did. That's what it looked like. It does not specifically say in the Quran that somebody was substituted. It simply says it